Thanks, go team. Oh, bye. I know our feelings.
And welcome to Grace's thesis oration. It's been a pleasure working with Grace on her thesis this past semester. I particularly want to commend her on two things. One, the integration of a number of authors into a nice, coherent narrative argument, which doesn't always happen in my experience, but I think it did happen this time. And second, for putting up with my nitpicking, which I engaged in quite a lot of this past semester. And I think Grace made a wonderful sparring partner, and I think the results will speak for themselves. So please welcome Grace.
Before we begin, I would like to thank Dr. Bolin for being my advisor, Dr. Judd for being my second reader, and Dr. Shields for being here today to be my third panelist. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Blessed be the Lord, my rock, who trains my hands for battle, my fingers for war. My safeguard and my fortress, my stronghold, my deliverer, my shield in whom I trust, who subdues peoples under me. As we pray, all glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Amen. Very good. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger makes the provocative claim that the category of relation is somehow co-equal with that of substance. In the book, The Introduction to Christianity, he writes, quote, "With the insight that seen as substance, God is one, but that there exists in him the phenomenon of dialogue, of differentiation, and of relationship through speech, the category of relatio, that is to say relation, gained a completely new significance for Christian thought. To Aristotle, it was among the accidents, the chance circumstances of being, which are distinct from substance, the sole sustaining form of the real. The experience of the God who conducts a dialogue, of the God who is not only logos, but also dialogos. Not only thought and meaning, but conversation and word in the reciprocity of those speaking to each other. This experience transcended the ancient division of reality into substance, the essential, and accidents, the merely coincidental. It now becomes clear that the dialogue, the relatio, stands beside the substance as an equally primordial form of being." Now, here, effectively, Ratzinger is calling for a revolution in traditional Aristotelian metaphysics. But before we can really unpack this quote and what it entails, first we're going to have to do an overview of what Aristotle's understanding of being was in the first place. So let's begin by breaking down for Aristotle the basic definition of substance, accident, and relation. In Aristotle's understanding of being, there are 10 primary ways of saying that something is, or that to be can be predicated of something. And these are called the 10 categories of being. And among the 10 categories, there are two major types. there are substance, which actually occupies one of the categories, and then the other 9 categories are termed accidents. Substance, for Aristotle, he defines in his book called The Categories. He says, quote, "Substance in the truest and primary and most definite sense of the word is that which is neither predicable of a subject nor present in a subject. For instance, the individual man or horse. But in a secondary sense, those things are called substances within which, as species, the primary substances are included. Also those which, as genera, include the species. For instance, the individual man is included in the species man, and the genus to which the species in the genus belongs is animal. These, therefore, that is to say, the species man and the genus animal, are termed secondary substances." So for Aristotle, substances are things that exist in themselves. They have somewhat of an independent existence, and for this reason, they are said to subsist. Primary substances are specific existing things. We could take, for example, Dr. Shields. While secondary substances are more general existing things, like the species man. Now, accidents, on the other hand, for Aristotle, are things that are present in or inhering in a subject. In other words, and unlike substances, they don't exist in themselves, but they only exist as present in something else. An example of an accident would be color. We could take, for example, the color red. Redness doesn't exist in itself, but it only exists as the color of something else. For instance, the color of a puffy. Now that we have a brief grasp of Aristotle's definition for substance and accident, let's take a look at what he says about relation. In the categories, Aristotle writes, quote, "Those things are called relative, which, being either said to be of something else or related to something else, are explained by reference to that other thing." Now, in addition to this definition, the traditional understanding of relation has 3 major components. There are the 2 related terms, which are also called the relatives, the correlatives, or the relata, and then there is the mode of the relation itself between the 2 things. Moreover, and importantly, for Aristotle, relation is always an accident. Relations don't exist in themselves, but they only exist as present in, or rather between, other substances. W. Norris Clarke, in his book, On Person and Being, writes about this specifically accidental feature of relation. He writes, quote, "For the very meaning of relation implies that it is between 2 terms that it is connecting, between 2 relateds. A relation cannot relate nothing. Thus, a related is not simply identical with its relation, reducible to it without remainder. It is distinct from it, though not separable from it, as related. No relation can be self-supporting by itself. If what it relates is itself a relation, then we must look further for a grounding of that, and there cannot be an infinite regress here. There must be an in itself, somewhere along the line, to ground the betweenness. And this is the ontological role of substance in a being, to provide an abiding unifying center for a being's relations and other attributes." Another way of articulating what Clarke is saying here is to ask the question, without prior relata, without prior related terms, what is there to have a relation between? It seems, on the other hand, that a relation will always presuppose substances between which the relation can be had. And as such, relation must necessarily always be posterior to substance. Now, this is the primary issue with trying to make the claim, as Ratzinger does, that the category of relation, or that relation, could be somehow co-equal with substance. It seems, on the other hand, that it is necessarily always going to be posterior to substance. With this in mind, that this is kind of the crux of the issue here, let's make a return to what Ratzinger says. In another place in the introduction to Christianity, he writes, quote, "The concept of mere substance, parenthetically equals what stands in itself, exclamation mark, is shattered, and it is made apparent how being that truly understands itself grasps at the same time that in being itself, it does not belong to itself, that it only comes to itself by moving away from itself and finding its way back as relatedness to its true primordial state." In effect, Ratzinger is asking us to shatter the traditional precedent of our understanding of substance here, and somehow incorporate relation in such a way that it is not merely accidental or merely posterior to substance. However, the primary question at hand now becomes, how are we supposed to reconcile this idea with the concern that Clarke articulated, that on the other hand, it seems necessary that relation be always posterior to substance. There are two major authors that we are going to take a look at today to see if we can try to reconcile these two positions. The first of these is the philosopher and theologian David Schindler, who takes his argument from yet another theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar. Now, the point of departure for von Balthasar is within Trinitarian theology. The central claim that he's making, that Schindler takes, is to say that receptivity is a positive perfection, not implying potency or lack, because the Son, the second person of the Trinity, is his relation of receptivity to the Father. While this claim seems totally unrelated to the matter at hand, for Schindler, this will ultimately entail that we must see substance as fundamentally relative and as fundamentally relational. But before we can unpack how we can say that receptivity is a positive perfection because the Son is his relationship of receptivity to the Father, first we're going to have to do an overview of some of the nuts and bolts of Trinitarian theology. In God, there are not parts, accidents, or composition, because God is simple and he is pure act. Now, because of this, one of the most basic questions in Trinitarian theology is how do we reconcile multiple persons in God with the teaching of his absolute simplicity? It seems, on the other hand, that multiple persons would imply composition or parts in some way or another on the part of God. However, the persons of the Trinity are distinguished exclusively by their relations to each other. And these relative distinctions don't actually compromise God's absolute simplicity within his essence. St. Thomas Aquinas writes about this in the Summa Theologica. Surprise, surprise. Quote, "Every plurality of things said absolutely is excluded from God because of his highest unity and simplicity. Not, however, a plurality of relations. For relations are predicated of something in reference to another, and thus they do not imply composition in that of which they are said, as Boethius teaches." And in another place, Thomas Aquinas writes again, reinforcing this claim. He says, quote, "There is real distinction in God, not indeed according to something absolute, which can only be his essence, and in which there is the highest unity and simplicity, but according to something relative." So, while the teaching of God's absolute simplicity doesn't deny the possibility of multiple relations, it does deny the possibility of multiple absolute or non-relative entities. And for this reason, we cannot say that God is a composition of substance and accidents, essence and existence, or act and potency, because all of these things would imply a difference within God's essence, contradicting the teaching of absolute simplicity within its essence. However, on the other hand, not only do multiple relations not contradict a thing's simplicity, but in fact, the more simple something is, the more relations will actually belong to it. And Thomas Aquinas again writes about this in the Disputed Questions on the Power of God. Quote, "A multiplicity of relations between one thing and another is not against the notion of that thing's simplicity. Rather, the simpler a thing is, the more relations belong to it. For the more simple something is, the less its power is limited, and so its causality extends to more things." Now, in addition to this, while in most relations, the relata exists prior to the relation, and the relation merely describes the terms that are related to each other, within the Trinity, the persons are said to be subsisting relations. The intra-Trinitarian relations actually constitute the persons in relation because the relation itself is the only difference between the terms. If there was an additional difference between the terms, this would be a difference that was a non-relative one, going against the teaching of God's absolute simplicity within his essence. And so, because the relation is the only difference between the terms, it actually constitutes the person in relation within the Trinity. And for this reason, for example, we say that the Son is his relation to the Father. Now, with this foundation laid, let's make a return to Balthasar's more central argument. Although the Son is co-equal and co-eternal with the Father, the Son is begotten by the Father. Now, this begottenness is what is his relationship of receptivity to the Father. And for this reason, Schindler and Balthasar will both claim that receptivity must be a positive perfection because the Son is God and cannot have imperfections. Now, all of creation is made through the Word, as we learn in the Gospel of John, through the image of Christ, who himself is the image of the unseen God and the firstborn of all creation, Colossians 1:15. And on account of this fact, being made through the Word, all of creation actually images God first in the begottenness of the Son, the Word through whom all things were made. This ultimately, for Schindler and Balthasar, will mean that receptivity is a perfection as well in creatures. Schindler writes about this. He says, if you can flip your pages here, in the light of this, the most basic thing to be said about creatures is that they are children in the child. Creatures image God, not first as Father, he who goes out of himself, who pours himself forth, who communicates himself, but as Son, he who receives from another, who is communicated. They image the perfection of God, not first as agent, but as patient. They are empowered to represent the agency of the Father only in and through the patience of the Son. So, as we said already, because the Son is co-equal with the Father, because the Son is God, receptivity must be a positive perfection in him. But because creatures are not God, it is much more difficult to see how we can make a similar claim about creatures. Schindler writes about this difficulty as well. He says, quote, "The poverty of Christ, indicated here to be a perfection, because it is coincident with Christ's absolute equality with the Father, must be distinguished from the poverty of the creature, which, because it is coincident with the creature's absolute inequality with the Father, must thereby, in some essential sense, be a sign of deficiency. Nonetheless, notwithstanding this ever greater difference, the creature's own being from, insofar as the image is Christ's own being from, remains thereby first a perfection. So as we've already said, because the Son is co-equal with the Father, receptivity can't be an imperfection. If the Son was in some way unequal with the Father, this would imply an additional difference within the essence of God, going against the teaching of absolute simplicity. However, between the creature and the Creator, there is an absolute inequality. And the characteristics of related terms will always inform the way that those terms relate to each other. And accordingly, the absolute inequality between the creature and the Creator cannot but inform this relationship of receptivity between the creature and the Creator, and seem to imply some sort of potency or lack on the part of the creature. However, Schindler's response to this is to say that insofar as the creature is imaging Christ in his perfection of receptivity, that its own receptivity must first and foremost be seen as a perfection, although it is yet coincident with the creature's inequality with God. Now, ultimately, Schindler decides to close this line of argument with a moment's reflection on Mary in John Paul II's Mulieris Dignitatem. In Mulieris Dignitatem, JP2 writes that Mary is the archetype of humanity, precisely in the receptivity of her fiat. Although Mary's fiat is a free act, or agere, as opposed to a created substance's being, its esse, Mary's fiat parallels the givenness that a created creature has, its givenness from the Father. Mary's fiat actually just echoes this relationship between the creature and the Creator. Schindler writes, "The fiat repeats in freedom the receptive relation to God that is already constitutive of the proper meaning of the created order." Ultimately, what Schindler does is he takes this idea and ends up proposing a triple dimension of esse. But before we unpack this triple dimension, first let's make a quick distinction between esse and agere. While esse is Latin for to be, it is what a created substance is. Agere is Latin for to do. It is what a thing does. And what you do is intimately bound up with who you are. Things are very intimately related. But while most people would very easily stack hands on the idea that in what we do, we ought to be receptive and in a relationship of receptivity to God, what Schindler wants to say is actually something more radical. He wants to say that there is a relationship of receptivity in the whatness of what you are, prior even to your agere, in your essay. And so he ends up suggesting a triple dimension of essay. First, there is esse ab, being from. Then there is esse in, being in itself. And lastly, there is esse ad, or being toward another. And in the scheme, he gives esse ab, or your being from, ontological priority. And for him, the priority of this being from, this esse ab, emerges from the priority of this relationship of receptivity between the creature and the creator. All created substances are first received. There is a givenness to all of created reality because it is first being from the Father. And on account of this fact, creation actually images the begottenness of the begotten Son, the Word through whom all things are made. However, this scheme still leaves a number of questions on the table. First off, what exactly does Schindler's esse ab entail more fully or more concretely? Second, what's relations role in all of this? And lastly, the question that we had set out with from the beginning has still not been answered. At this point in the argument, it is not clear how we are supposed to see relation as anything but posterior to substance still. I am of the opinion that despite engaging in a very different conversation than that of Schindler and Ratzinger, the work of one of our very own faculty, Dr. Daniel Shields, shed some light on the potential significance of Schindler's esse ab. Shields wrote an article responding to the problem of providential collapse, which is an event that is seen as a necessary consequence of the classical theist response to modal collapse. However, for the sake of time and simplicity, I will have to collapse these arguments and simply just give us a brief overview of what is modal collapse, and then how does Shields' suggestion offer some sort of resolution to its potential threat. So let's begin with modal collapse. The point of departure for modal collapse is the teaching of God's absolute simplicity as well as his absolute necessity. Because God is simple, he is pure act, and his act is one. However, his act is also a creative act. And the creative act can be nothing other than God's own act of existence/essence, because if it was an additional act within God, there would be multiple acts in God, going against the teaching of his absolute simplicity. So the creative act must be God. However, God is also necessary. In turn, the creative act would be deemed necessary, and implying that creation, its effects, would also be necessary. Now, this dilemma is what is termed modal collapse, because it goes against the teaching of God's absolute freedom in creation. Moreover, modal collapse kind of offers us only two alternatives, at least two obvious alternatives. The first of these would be to say that creation is necessary. This would mean that there is no contingency in creation, and in turn, this would mean that anything that exists cannot cease to exist, and anything that does not exist could not come into being, because any existing thing would necessarily be so. Now, this goes directly against our common sense experience of a world where things come into and pass out of being all of the time. One way of potentially trying to reconcile this with our common sense experience would be to say that freedom, contingency, and time are all an illusion. However, this is not remotely satisfying. The only other obvious alternative would be to predicate multiple acts of God, to say that his creative act is an act that is separate and distinct from his own act of existence/essence. However, this is incompatible with an internally consistent understanding of God. It's kind of similar to proposing a quasi-Platonic cosmos, where there are multiple sources of being, as opposed to one absolute supreme source of all being. So neither of these are viable options. The one of them goes directly against our common sense experience, while the other is incompatible with an internally consistent understanding of God. At this point in the oration, it should come as no surprise that the key to solving this problem is relation. Shields ends up suggesting that all of creation is brought about and determined by God's relations to it, and that this scheme both affords for contingency in reality and at the same time does not imperil God's absolute divine simplicity. He takes inspiration for this from Trinitarian theology, in which we see that God's multiple relations ad intra within himself do not compromise his divine simplicity. Similarly, God can have multiple relations ad extra with outside of himself that would not similarly compromise his absolute simplicity. He ends up suggesting that there are three relations that bring about and determine a created substance. First, there is God's relation of knowing a creature as possible. Then there is God's relation of willing that creature as actual. And lastly, there is God's relation of knowing that creature as actual. And the last of these relations would be posterior to the second, because God would know a creature as actual in virtue of having willed its actual existence in the first place. Shields writes, quote, "These relations of God's willing or not willing creatures are contingent and determine whether the creatures to which they relate become actual. In so doing, they also determine whether God's one simple and necessary act is an act of creating or not, and whether it is an act of creating this or of creating that. God's relation of willing a creature is not determined by the joint existence of the creature and of God, but rather the existence of God plus his relation of willing the creature determine the actual existence of the creature." In this, what I would like to point out is that although Shields will only say that the creature is determined and brought about by God's relation to them, I would like to say that these relations are actually what constitute a created substance, because God is creating ex nihilo. Because God creates ex nihilo, there is nothing to differentiate the creature's actual existence from God's will relation to it. And in virtue of being constitutive of created substance, I would also argue that relation is now seen as coextensive with substance. However, the next thing I would like to point out is that this is profoundly consonant with Schindler's idea of the esse ob. While Schindler was saying that there's a primacy to this relationship of receptivity between God and the creature, what it seems to be saying, what I'm able to say with Shields ultimately, is that this relation actually is what constitutes a created substance. Despite all of this, our initial difficulty that we had set out with still stands on the table. At this point, it is not clear how we are supposed to see relation as anything but posterior to substance. Most classically trained philosophers would probably instinctively object to the idea that a relation could be prior to and determine a substance, because on the other hand, it seems like relation is necessarily always posterior to substance. Another way of putting the contradiction would be to say that before a thing exists, it, whatever that could mean at that point, is already in relation. Now, Shields actually brings forth an illustration in order to show how we can actually see relation as prior to and determining substance. He writes, quote, "I will to eat a sandwich that doesn't exist yet. It's a new type of sandwich, never before made by anyone. I am in the relationship of freely willing it to this non-existent sandwich. Although the sandwich does not exist, while my idea of it does, I nevertheless will the sandwich and not my idea of it. For I cannot eat my idea, and I will precisely to eat the object of my will act. My relationship of willing to the sandwich causes my body to move about and make the sandwich, thus rendering the possible sandwich actual. The sandwich's absolute existence is brought about and determined by my prior will relationship to the sandwich. Neither the sandwich's actuality nor its possible characteristics determine my relationship to it. If the sandwich's characteristics determined my will's relationship to it, then my willing it would not be free. But by hypothesis, it is freely willed. It is thus possible for a relation to have characteristics of its own that do not depend on the absolute characteristics of its relata. Although this sandwich seems almost to come out of left field, what this illustration accomplishes is actually tremendously profound. Before this, we could not have conceived how a relation could be anything but posterior to substance. But in this example, we see that Shields' will relation is actually prior to and determines the actual existence of the sandwich in a real way. However, there's at least one major difference between God's will relation to a created substance and Shield's will relation to his sandwich. While God creates ex nihilo, Shield merely avails himself of his refrigerator. And in virtue of this difference, God's will relation actually constitutes the creature in a way that Shield's will relation does not constitute his sandwich. Because God's will relation actually constitutes the creature ex nihilo, there is nothing to differentiate God's will relation from the actual existence of a created substance. And on account of this, I would say that we can now recast substance as a constitutive relation to God. We can now recast substance as relation. Ultimately, how does all of this come back to bear on Ratzinger's initial quote? At the outset, we had read that Ratzinger wanted to understand created reality not only in virtue of the logos, but also of the dialogos. In virtue of the logos, all of creation actually reflects and communicates God in its inherent order, its intelligibility, its intellectual structure. In virtue of the dialogos, created reality reflects and communicates God in its relationality. However, fittingly enough, since all of creation is actually made through the logos, through the word, as we learn in the Gospel of John, the word logos already has this double significance. The Greek logos can be taken into the Latin as ratio, which is to say reason, which would be significant of the universe's intellectual structure. However, logos can also be taken into the Latin as verbum, which is to say word. And word is an existence that is entirely way and relation between the speaker and the spoken to. Ratzinger writes about this in the Introduction to Christianity. He says, quote, "He who is here is word. He is consequently spoken, and hence the pure relation between the speaker and the spoken to. Thus, logos Christology, as word theology, is once again the opening up of being to the idea of relationship. For again, it is true that word comes essentially from someone else and to someone else. Word is an existence that is entirely way and openness." So all of creation being made through the word, through the logos, as we learn in the Gospel of John, actually reflects and communicates its double significance in both its intellectual as well as relational structure. Ultimately, thus far, this whole argument is simply meant to provide a metaphysical basis for something that is already a largely ubiquitous Christian intuition. Within Christianity, relation is already seen as something profoundly central and important. Man's origin, life, and ultimate end are all seen in terms of relation. Man is made through a communion. The Christian life is always within a community. The liturgical act is essentially communal. Salvation is a common good. And man's ultimate end is seen as a communion with God. And God reveals himself as a communion of persons. So we can already see that relation is something profoundly important to Christianity. This argument is simply meant to buttress this Christian intuition and deepen it by providing for it a basis in metaphysics. Thus far with Schindler, we've said that there is a relationship of receptivity between the creature and the creator. And with Shields, I've ultimately argued that that relationship is actually constitutive of a substance. However, I would like to round out this progression with some sandbox philosophy, so to speak, in order to illustrate the potential implications of this argument. Ratzinger writes in the Introduction to Christianity that because man is made imago Dei, in the image of God, and because God reveals himself as a communion of persons, bursting our understanding of singular and plural, that, quote, "There is no such thing as person in the categorical singular." Now, the claim I would like to make is going to be more radical because I am operating off of the theory that all created substances are relations. And in virtue of this fact, I would say that a created substance essentially is as an essay in reference to another. It is fundamentally relative. There is no such thing as the purely singular, and there is no such thing as independent existence. And when I say there's no such thing as independent existence, I do not mean to say we are all accidents inhering in God, not that kind of dependent existence, but rather independent existence as such, is recast and reconceived as existence toward another. Being in itself is recast as being toward another, and ultimately substance is recast as relation. This idea brings to mind a similar phenomenon that happens within aspen trees. Aspens are one of the largest organisms on the planet, and despite appearances, the individual trees of a grove are not actually distinct organisms. They are all connected through their root systems. In a similar way, a created substance is not an isolated event, existing in the strictest sense in the singular. Rather, it possesses an aspen-like dimension. Now, as a consequence of denying the purely singular, Ratzinger also denies pure objectivity. He writes, quote, "There is no such thing as a mere observer, and there is no such thing as pure objectivity." Now, the context of this quote is within a reference to the work of Schrödinger. Schrödinger's work in physics is profoundly consonant with a deeply rich and relational understanding of being. In virtue of the fact that all of creation is made not only through the logos, but also the dialogos, all of creation is an inherent dialogue with the reality around it. Intercourse between all being is held, an inherent dialogue in virtue of reality's relational structure. One cannot simply stand apart as a mere observer in strict and sterile analysis of the reality around oneself. Rather, there is a sort of porousness or permeability to the skin of distinct beings, whereby they are held in figurative conversation. To use a mathematical analog, beings are far more continuous than they are discrete. Far from being isolated and cellular, beings are aspen-like, woven into a relational fabric, a complex network of relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace. We will start with questions from our panel.
If we think of normal relationships from everyday experience, right? We sometimes think of them as a single thing between two or more people or things, but we often think of them as twofold, right? That if I have a friend, I relate to the friend and the friend relates to me, right? We could distinguish those two things, like my relationship to him, his relationship to me. I found it somewhat unclear whether you were trying to say that a creature is God's relation of willing that creature to be, or whether the creature was a relation back to God, or are you saying those are the same thing?
So are you asking if the way that the creature relates to God is the same as God relates to the creature?
No, I'm asking whether the creature is God's relation to it, or whether it's relation to God.
I think that it would have to be God's relation to it, because don't you, you have to have God prior to the relation in order for the creature to be brought about. I think if you're saying that it's emerging from the creature, or we're seeing it from the perspective of the creature, that creature would have to be actually existing in order for that to actually be what brings itself about, right? If its own relation to God is what brought about its actual existence, it would have to exist in the first place in order to be there to, have that relation to God. That seems like it would imply a contradiction, but I'm not sure. Yeah, at least how I'm thinking through it now.
Okay, so you said that's a difference in the case of God's relationship to the creature and my relationship to the sandwich, right? Because in the case of my relationship to the sandwich, clearly my relationship to the sandwich is distinct from the sandwich, because it doesn't exist yet, but I want it, right?
Correct.
So my wanting or my relating to it has to be distinct from it, right? And you said, okay, but it's different in that case because I don't make it ex nihilo.
Yeah.
But God makes it the creature ex nihilo. But I guess I'm worried if you were to say that the creature is nothing but God's relationship to it because he makes it ex nihilo, then it sounds like there is no creation ex nihilo because nothing's being made ex nihilo because there's just God and his relation and nothing else.
Interesting. I'm not sure how I see that would imply that nothing is being made, I guess. Because it seems like he'll have these relations to possible creatures, right? And from that, those are determined as actual creatures in virtue of the way he decides to relate his will. And that relation will actually bring about the existence of an actual creature from nothingness as opposed to what, you know?
Yeah, I guess I'm saying there's nothing there except God and his relationship to the creature. So the creature hasn't actually been brought out of nothingness, right? Unless you, a relation has to be between, right? But there's nothing for the relationship to be between. There's just God and the relation.
Yes, I think the way that it was talked about in the article Simply Providential was to say that it's between God and the yet non-existent creature. And that seems to me precisely to indicate that God would be creating ex nihilo because the creature is yet non-existent. But God, of course, can create ex nihilo because he's almighty. Perhaps I'm not understanding your difficulty.
Well, I guess the point is that it's going to be like the sandwich example in that the relationship will bring the thing about, right? But if the thing's got to be brought about, it has to actually emerge from nothingness, right?
Is the difficulty there related to that? What Clark says in quotation 4, that he says that a related can't simply be identical with its relation, but it sounds like you want to say it is simply identical with its relation?
Yes, that's true. But also the persons of God are identical with their relations. I think that type of relation we're talking about here is a subsisting relation. If you're going to recast substance as a relation, it has to subsist in a real way, but it's reconceived. It's not understood in itself exclusively, but as essentially toward another.
Yeah, so you were disagreeing with Clark, right?
Correct. Yeah, he's the point at which we're trying to reconcile. Like he's the primary
so
issue.
I was trying to understand the nature of
the difference.
Yeah, it just seems much more plausible to say, if one wanted to say that the creature was a relation, that it was a relation to God. So you could distinguish God's relation to the creature and then the creature's relation to God. Otherwise, I'm kind of worried about us kind of sliding into a kind of pantheism where we're all just aspects of God.
I think his relation to the creature brings about the creature's distinct existence from the creator. And so we're not trying to posit a sort of pantheism because God actually relates to it as a creature, not as he does to himself. The creatures aren't subsisting relations like the persons of God are. They're actually distinct from himself.
But it's got to relate to the possible or actual creature. And it seems like if there's no creature, then just a relation, then he's not relating to anything.
As in, that would imply that he's relating to something that is yet non-existent, and which actually is brought about into actual existence. That seems like that would be the implication of what you're saying, which I'm not sure if I understand what's problematic.
If God's relation to the creature was itself the creature, then I think there is no in between. There's just God and the creature.
I think this is maybe connected, maybe sort of related or a different angle to take it from. Could you just mentioned this suggestion that you're sort of recasting substance as relation in regard to the creature. How is it that would not be the case? how is it that it would not be the case that creatures would be subsisting relations? You just mentioned that that wouldn't be the case as it is in God, where the persons of the Trinity are subsisting relations. How is it that what you were just describing would not also result in creatures being subsisting relations?
I think in the sense of subsisting relation where it is in itself, it's not an accident in God. I would say that it is a relation that subsists. However, I wouldn't say that it is the same as the subsisting relations within God. I think that God's relation to the creature, the way that the article talked about it, was said to bring about the characteristics and determine the characteristics of the creature in such a way that, like, it's a contingent relation. It's bringing about a creature as opposed to his own self-knowledge, the way he relates to himself, right? And so the relation actually constitutes or brings about a creature with differences between the creature and the creator that are also coincident with that, besides just it's the relative one.
Another way maybe to put the objection here is that, don't we want to say that God has esse ad creaturam, but the creature has esse ab deo?
Okay.
And we want to distinguish those things?
And say that they're not identical.
Yeah.
I think that they are distinct in virtue of the fact that one of them is experienced from one of the relata and the other one is from the perspective of the other relata. If we can say that God has a perspective, I don't know.
But I thought you were trying to say there is no second relata. There's just God and the relation.
Right. Not until the creature's actual existence is brought about, right?
Okay, but if we're saying the creature's actual existence is brought about and we have two relata, then we have relations between them. God's relation to esse ad, the creature, and then the creature's relation to God, esse ab.
Yes. The question.
I guess I'm still not seeing how the creature can be God's relation to it and yet be distinct from God.
Because if he has relations that bring about the existence of a creature, it necessarily is God. Like, I don't see if I follow how you're coming back to saying that it must be distinct. It can't be distinct from God, I guess.
I don't know. It feels like you're both saying that they're relata, distinct relata, and that they aren't distinct relata. So I'm not sure how to put it in my head anymore.
I would say that the relata are distinct, but one of the relata is brought about and determined. It doesn't yet exist until God wills it actually, right? And he establishes this relation. So it is brought about and determined by the way that God decides to and determines to relate his will to it.
But it's one thing to say, to just be clear on which you're saying, that God's relationship in a way causes the creature to be, or to say, and that's different than saying that God's relationship is the creature's
constitutes
being.
it. Yeah, it seems to me that in causing ex nihilo, though, that how would you say anything but that there could be nothing to differentiate its actual existence from the way that he relates to it?
That's the whole beauty of creation ex nihilo. It's just, it's there, and it came out of nothing. But anyway.
I'd like to ask a question. So if we just take this thesis and run with it, it's not clear to me that I would end up saying substance and relation are co-equal. It feels a little more like I should say there is no substance, right? That is, as you know, after Aristotle gives this definition of relation in the categories, he says, well, actually, if we use this, it will turn out that some substances are relative, and we want to keep those separate. So let's narrow down our definition of relation, and he modifies it to things for which to be is to be toward another. It seems like that what you're saying is that there are created beings and there are uncreated beings, the uncreated being, and the uncreated being is subsisting relation, and the created beings are some kind of constitutive relation. So it sounds like to me that what we're actually saying is that just in general, to be is to be toward another, and therefore it's not that they're co-equal, but that there are no substances, there are only relations. So
I think that I wouldn't say that there is no such thing as substance, but that it's recast, that we're kind of, like as Ratzinger said, shattering how it was previously understood, that being in itself like when you say that to be is to be toward another, I would say that to be in itself, to subsist, to be substancing, is actually recast as something fundamentally relative, something that is fundamentally toward another. I don't see how that annihilates this idea of substance entirely. I see it borrowing characteristics of both the category of substance as well as the category of relation.
Well, I just mean that it would seem to follow that every being meets the strict definition of relative.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's fundamentally relative. I think that fundamentally Aristotle kind of fails to keep those two categories sufficiently distinct. So they're bleeding into each other.
Them collapsing more than them being co-equal but distinct.
Yeah, I guess perhaps they are less distinct than he had wanted them to be. Okay. I would say.
You have some otherwise.
Yeah, I've got another question too. Thank you, Grace. Let me see. So it seems as though what Ratzinger is putting forth is to say the revelation of the Trinity becomes for Christians something like an occasion for rethinking the whole nature of substance and relation. But the idea is not to create some kind of metaphysics that requires revelation, but simply that the revelation of the Trinity is a kind of occasion for rethinking the nature of reality, but that we could, in theory, come to an understanding of the nature of reality without that revelation. In other words, if that is in fact the case, that reality just simply has this kind of nature, that it's fundamentally relational in this way, does that reopen for us the question about the sort of theological question, whether we can know the Trinity by reason? Does that make sense, that question, to say, right, for St. Thomas, it's clear that the Trinity is something that we can only come to by revelation, not by reason.
Yes. Yeah.
But if in fact the nature of reality is such that it has this fundamental relational nature as you describe it, does that reopen the theological question whether the Trinity can be knowable by reason alone?
I wouldn't say so. I would actually say the opposite of that. I think that I relied on theology, especially with Schindler, specifically to get to this idea of metaphysics. And so I would say, to the opposite of that, actually, this idea of metaphysics is somewhat only comes about after you have the revelation of the Trinity, right? And I think that's also consonant with something, is it Gaudium and Spes, where it says man isn't fully known until the revelation of Christ. And I know that we're talking about created substance more generally, not just man, but I think that it's kind of a parallel idea to that, except on a broader scale.
Yeah, that's helpful. I guess the distinction I was trying to make note of was to say, I think what Ratzinger would want to say is that while it's the case that the revelation of the Trinity provides the occasion for rethinking these elements about the nature of reality, it's not that revelation is not necessary for us to actually know reality and know the nature of a being and the nature of relation and substance itself. That even though it happens to provide that occasion right now for us, in theory, we could in fact just look at the nature of reality and we could have come to know that nature of reality on its own. Yeah. Apart from that revelation. But if that is in fact the case, if nature just reflects this way of being, this relational way of being, I don't know, it seems to me like it would open the door potentially to say, if reality is like this, couldn't we know something about God from this nature of reality? Yeah. Personally, I don't see how I would argue for this idea of substance without the Trinity. And so I wouldn't agree with that. Okay. Yeah.
At this point, I need to assert my executive privilege and open up the audience.
JP.
Thank you, Grace, for your oration. I was just wondering a little bit about quote 8. Ratzinger says that the simpler a thing is, the more relations it has, and the more simple something is, the less its power is limited, and so its causality extends to more things. But that doesn't seem like common experience. Like, a pebble seems more simple than I am,
Mm-hmm.
and yet it also seems to have less causality than I do.
Mm-hmm.
So could you just explain how this principle works?
Yeah, first off, it's Aquinas that says
I'm
this, not Ratzinger. But that's besides the point. The way I was understanding him was kind of like how we talked about in metaphysics this last semester. As you go higher and higher on the order of being, the more actuality something has. I mean, like we're talking about like non-composite substances, like intellectual substances, I think as well. Those relate in a causal way to more things. Like, yeah, that's how I understood it. Avenicio?
Thank you for your oration, Grace. I was wondering if you could maybe reconcile these two thoughts. One, that God is changeless, right? God is ultimately simple, and that in the act of is like relation in him or with him.
Yeah, so that's a great question, actually. Within the article, Simply Providential, Shields addresses this idea, like if there's changes in the way that God decides to relate to things, does that imply a change in God? And actually, if we take up the libertarian account of free will, we can basically say that God's will is identical to itself, irrespective of how he determines it to relate to other things. I'm not an expert in libertarian free will, but the idea being that there's no difference within something before it wills. And so the will is identical in God, just irrespective of how it chooses to relate. He chooses to relate to creatures. Sophie.
Thank you for your research. I was wondering if you could just say a few words more of clarification on what Schindler means by poverty, quote 10.
Yeah. So because Schindler's claim is to say receptivity is a perfection, this is kind of counterintuitive to our understanding of receptivity, where it generally implies some sort of want, lack, poverty, and imperfection of some sort. And so basically he's saying, like, air quotes, the poverty of Christ here indicated to be a perfection. He's talking about how that in Christ, this receptivity is actually not an imperfection.
So then, like, when you're receptive, you're taking in something that you don't have. So that's like the understanding of the lack.
Yeah, that would,
It's not a negative lack.
yeah. Mm-hmm. Dr. Olson.
I wonder if you could sort of step away from God for a little bit and talk about what this theory would mean for relation and substance more generally. Like if I say, would I end up saying something like the way that 3 is bigger than 2 is the kind of being that's co-equal with 3 and 2?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Or and also with that, so does it have that kind of implications generally? Or is it just something that you only want to say or in reference to God? So is there sort of more general implications, and then also is there something you can see? If that's the case, is there something where you could look at, say, the way 3 is to 2 and see something in that would suggest the theory?
The theory that I just said?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, interesting. To your first question, I would say that we still have accidental relations. Those are fairly common, basically ubiquitous. So this doesn't basically annihilate all of those, and I'd say they're still distinct from this relation that I'm talking about. This is a special kind of relation. And then what does this theory have implications on what it means to say how 3 stands to 2? Is that what you're talking about?
Sure, just relation more generally. Something that I could see so that I could, in a natural way, I could see that your argument seems plausible without having to make some kind of
Reference to God,
Yeah.
an appeal to God. That's what we were just talking about with Dr. Judd, and I think personally, I don't see how I would make this argument without appealing to God. Yeah, there might be a way, but that's not what I spent time on in my thesis. Sean?
Yeah, just a quick question. So really appreciate your thesis, Grace, your oration. Just curious if we have to rethink kind of the classical definitions of the human person, like how we participate in being, again, like thinking of Aristotle, man as rational animal, or we as like individual substance of rational nature. It seems that both those definitions don't kind of capture what you would say as like being in relation or being towards, again, kind of like thinking of JP2 when he says man is and woman are created in the image and likeness of God. There's something about their communion that is a revelation of like the heart of the Trinity.
Mm.
And it just seems, I'm just curious if you kind of given any thought if this like metaphysical shattering of being would affect the way that we perceive our own being.
I think so. I think something I like to think about is especially like Christ and the statement of action of who he is. Because Christ is the firstborn of all creation. He's the new man, the new Adam. We are reborn through him. And as the old Adam kind of stood for in my mind, I see him standing for in himself and grasping creation for himself. The new Adam stands entirely, like his whole statement of action is toward another in the fact that he is the word, which is in existence, which is entirely in relation. But moreover, like in the statement of action of the incarnation itself and the whole kenotic movement of Christ, Christ didn't deem equality with something to be grasped with God, but rather emptied himself out. So not only just his incarnation, his advent, but his whole ministry, especially the cross. I think it kind of, and as we kind of are reborn in Christ, I think we can understand our identity in a new way as radically toward another, in imitation of Christ's kenotic movement, his self-emptying upon the cross. Another a point of reflection for ourselves would also be Mary, and what Schindler has already said there, that kind of radical receptivity is actually constitutive of the whatness of what we are. Yeah. Dr. Giesting.
Okay. There's so many things to say in so little time, so I did have one theological question actually I wanted to ask about this. So the Son is receptivity on this showing. My understanding of Trinitarian theology includes that the Son offers himself back to the Father, so that there is some, in a sense, a return flow, if you will, and that his offering on the cross is a temporal manifestation of his eternal offering himself back. Does that, that's more to set context for, we're talking about the Trinity, where's the Spirit? How does the Spirit fit into the Son?
I see. Yeah, I did think about this a little bit when I was, preparing for this oration, because I thought it was interesting that I don't think it never came into, the Holy Spirit never came into my thesis much, which is definitely a lack. It's definitely a lack, but I guess I have to say I just haven't spent time in seeing how that would incorporate as a reflection upon this new understanding of like fundamentally relational being.
And the bit about, the word being spoken, who's he being spoken to?
I mean, I guess to all of man, to creation, like creation is made through the word, and back again to the Father. I guess there's also the idea of exitus and reditus. Everything comes forth from the Father and it's back again to the Father. I think there's probably kind of just a lot of maybe subjects who are spoken to.
We are past time, so we need to call it there.